Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Erica Oriens, and I am the Executive Director of the Michigan Center for Student Success. Thanks for joining us today. We'll go ahead and get started. I think should take us less than an hour to get through the presentation, and so hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. I'll continue through the slides here. Oops. So this webinar is our first in a series of 5 webinars where we're focusing on the voluntary framework of accountability. And in this particular session, we're focusing on the VFA for developmental education. If you are new or are unfamiliar with the VFA, you can go out to the MCCA website on our events page, and you can see the recording or the slides for the VFA reports overview that we hosted on August 26th. And then if you're interested in looking at the VFA for economic stability and equity, or for transfer, or for student success, you can also register for those sessions at that same place as well. So we decided to host this series this summer. The Michigan community colleges have been involved in the voluntary framework of accountability for many years, but we wanted to make sure that we were supporting colleges in their efforts to use those data to understand more about their student success efforts. So part of the goals of our series are to understand how to read the VFA reports. We want to increase access to and use of the VFA reports. We want to provide opportunities for more institutions to benchmark with peer institutions and have a better understanding of how their student outcomes compare with other institutions in Michigan and across the country. And then finally, we know how challenging it is to create resources that are helpful to present data to a wide variety of stakeholders at the institution. And so we wanted to create and share a customizable template that you can use on your campus, and you can customize to meet your own needs to present the VFA data at your own college. So with that, we have these slides are available on the MCCA website. So if you need to see these slides, please go over to the events page on the MCCA website. You'll see the slides that we are presenting today. And then you will also see a slide deck that says editable at the end. And you can, that's in PowerPoint, and you can download that slide deck and then modify it and customize it to meet your needs. And we have removed a lot of these slides that we're doing here at the beginning about the Center for Student Success that you won't necessarily need when you're doing this presentation on your campus. Katie has added the link to that in the chat, and I think she'll probably add a couple other links during our presentation today as well if you wanted to go out there. So about the Center for Student Success, looking through the participants on our that are joining us today, I think I don't have to spend a whole lot of time going through these slides because it looks like we have some folks who are frequent attendees of a lot of our events. But we were, the Center for Student Success was created in 2011 with a grant from the Kresge Foundation to support the 28 community colleges in Michigan in their efforts to improve student outcomes. We have quite a few initiatives that we have launched and have been supporting over the last several years, and this is just an example of a few of those initiatives. And as you can see from our VFA series that I talked about before, we have connected our presentations about VFA to several of the initiatives that we have going on right now. And I'll point out that today's series really focuses on DevEd, and it really supports the work that we're doing with that Jenny Schenker is leading with the My Start to Finish initiative, which really focuses on developmental ed, and we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail later. I am joined by my lovely colleagues from the Center for Student Success, Precious Miller, Jenny Schenker, myself, and Katie Girardello as well. We make up the Center for Student Success team. And one thing we've learned in doing virtual events, that it really does take several people to pull off one of these virtual webinars. So I want to thank them for helping us out today and joining this webinar to support you as well. As I mentioned before, you can also navigate out to the MCCA website to register for upcoming events. One major upcoming event that we have going on over the next couple of weeks is our annual Student Success Summit. We can't quite figure out why we scheduled this during the same week that we're having 3 other huge events for us at the Center for Student Success, but Katie just added a link to the registration page for the center, or for the Student Success Summit in there. We have 6 sessions on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of this week, and Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday of next week. So I encourage you to go out there and register for those. We have over 1,000 spots available in each of those sessions. So please, if any of your colleagues haven't registered yet, please feel free to share that with them. I think we have some great content to share this year, like we do many years as well. In terms of engaging in this presentation, one thing that we like to do is ask participants to please rename yourself to include your college, and you can go to the participant pane and click on more, and you'll see a button that says rename. If you have questions or want to share resources, please use the Zoom chat feature where you can send a resource to everyone or to a specific person. And then if you also want to ask a question, you should find down in your participant pane somewhere that you should be able to raise your hand, and you would be able to unmute yourself and ask a question. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of the content. The Voluntary Framework of Accountability was created by the American Association of Community Colleges. And what it did was really expand the definition of what we mean by student success. As many of you know, historically, the only students that we really counted and tracked their outcomes were students who were full-time, first-time students. So it was the first time they attended college, and they attended college full-time. We also typically only tracked if a student completed a credential at the first institution they attended. And we typically only observed that time frame for a relatively short period of time. So we would look at 2 or 3 years to look at those outcomes. And so what the VFA did through AACC is worked on expanding those measures of student success so we could get a better picture of how well community college students do. The data are reported annually by the participating community colleges in the VFA, and that's really important because that means that each of your colleges has data that are reported in aggregate to the VFA, but then your IR office typically also has that source data that if you had other questions you wanted to ask about some of these outcomes, you have the data to do that analysis. For this presentation, we are going to focus on the VFA metrics after 1 year. So while the VFA looks at long-term outcomes and they look at completion of a degree and transfer after 6 years, in this particular presentation, we're going to look at the metrics after 1 year. And it's really critical. We know these metrics are important because they are predictors of long-term student success. So that's why these metrics were selected. is because they actually are fairly good predictors of how well students will do after in longer term outcomes like completion and transfer. For this particular session, we will focus on 3 metrics after 1 year related to DevEd. And we will talk about completion of college level math, college level English, and college level math and English. And so before we move on, I want to turn it over to my colleague Jenny Schenker to talk a little bit about why these metrics and why we think about these gateway courses in this way. Jenny?
Thanks, Erica. Good to see all of you today. So one of the things that you have probably been observing if you've been watching this data and the evolution of the national conversation around developmental education is this idea that students need to be exposed much earlier, placed much more quickly at college level, and have the experience of completing that college level gateway course rather than operating with the assumption that we did for many years, which is that students who were not as prepared as other students for college should be placed in a sequence of developmental education courses that progressed from, you know, very kind of basic content through eventually preparation for the college content. A lot of experiments and programs have indicated, am I not talking here? I'm just checking. A lot of research has concluded that students are able to do just as well, if not better, if they are placed immediately in a college level course with a support course like the ALP. And so this kind of the growth of the co-requisite remediation. And also research has shown that if students don't pass these courses within 1 year, they seem to be more likely to drop out, and the students that do pass them within more than 1 year are the students who are more likely to complete their programs. So before, you know, the one question that people start to ask immediately is whether, you know, where were the students placed in terms of passing, but that's not what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about how we're going to place them so that they can be successful quickly.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Sorry, I accidentally moved on to the next slide. I didn't want to cut you off, but I did want to share how VFA defines each of these metrics in the VFA. And so for college level English, the student attempted and successfully completed at least 1 non-developmental English course with a grade of A through C- or P in the first academic year. The same for math, and then they combine the two together between college level English and math. Important to note in this that this may differ slightly from what your institution defines as passing. And so just keep that in mind, that for the purposes of comparing the data across institutions, these are the definitions that we use. One of the things that we'd also like to note in here is when we start looking at the data, even minor changes in this may make a slight difference, but keep in mind that it may not make a major difference if we were to, for example, count Ds or D pluses in this definition. Certainly your IR office could answer if that would make a significant difference for your institution. But generally, it from a statewide or national perspective, it doesn't make a huge difference in the outcomes. If you want to learn more about the VFA, as I mentioned, you can look at the VFA Reports Overview webinar that we had on August 26th, or there is a lot more information on the VFA website. Okay. So we worked with some really helpful folks in IR to help us really narrow down what are the questions that we want to really ask that the VFA can help us answer as it relates to DevEd. So we came up with 4 questions. 1, what are our outcomes? 2, how do we compare with peers? 3, where are our equity gaps? And 4, what has changed over time? So those are the 4 data questions that we're going to go over in this presentation today. The first thing we're going to do is look at what are our outcomes, and I want to ask you a poll question. So if you are not currently looking at your screen, please do, because I'm going to launch a poll, and I hope somebody can give me a thumbs up if you can see the poll. Thank you. And the question is, what percentage of students pass college level math in the first year? The options are less than 20%, 20 to 50%, or more than 50%. So we've got about 60% of folks voting, and now we're up to over 90% of people have voted. That's great. So I'm going to give you a couple of you 2 more seconds, and then we're going to close the poll. And I'm going to share the results. And I hope I'm sharing the results with you. And it looks like we have a distribution here, kind of a fun distribution. So looks like 7 folks thought that less than 20% of students pass college level English in the first, or college level math. About 60% of people said between 20 and 50%, and just a couple people thought that more than 50% pass college level English. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. And we are going to move on to college level English. And so we'll repeat that poll. And we'll ask what percentage of students passed college level English in the first year. And I'll give you another few seconds to respond to that. I thought about writing out these numbers, TWE and TY percent for the English question, but I just decided to repeat the question. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling, and I'm going to share the results. And it looks like people thought students were doing slightly better. About 60% believe that between 20 and 50%, and about 40% of people thought that more than 50% passed. So I'm going to stop sharing those results. Hopefully you don't see that on my screen anymore, and let's look at the results. Okay, among all students who enrolled for the first time in a Michigan community college in the fall of 2017, of which there were 38,816 students, 21.9% passed college level math in the first year, 43.5% passed college level English, and 15.6% passed both college level English and math in the first year. So those are the outcomes for all the community colleges that participate in the VFA across Michigan in the fall of 2017. And I'll also turn it over to Jenny to see if there's anything that you want to add about these results before we move on.
So I just wanted to point out again, I see Chelsea's comment there. She thought it meant in the first year that they take it, not counting Dev Ed. And that is really what kind of the gist of this is that when you look to see how many students are able to pass college level English in the first year, that includes those that that have been placed in Dev Ed, that have been placed in those sequences of Dev Ed. And the thing is that if you don't get a chance to pass college English or college math in your first year, you are going to be disadvantaged by placement in those sequences of Dev Ed classes. So thank you, Chelsea.
Good point, Jenny. I think, yeah, this focuses on the success in those metrics as opposed to
the placement,
enrolling, yeah, or placing in those courses. So
right.
Good. Well, now we'll continue on a similar vein when we look at some of the other data. So keep that in mind as we're looking through those questions. Okay, so how do we compare to our peers? So I'm going to launch another poll question because there's nothing we like to compare ourselves. And I'm going to launch a poll asking, are my institution's outcomes better or worse than my peers in Michigan and nationally? So we're asking if you think your institution, do you do better or do you do worse than your peers? And this is one of the really great things that VFA provides is that ability for you to compare your data with institutions across the country, particularly because I think in some cases, some of these numbers are difficult to interpret in a vacuum if you're not seeing numbers from other institutions across the country as well. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and share the results. And I don't think it could get any closer, but we have a 50-50 tie with half the institutions thinking that they do better than their peers in Michigan and half the institutions think they do worse. So we will go ahead and look at the results of that. And of course, I don't have data for your specific college. And so in the presentation, we've left that information in here. And you can look at your institution's data when you can find out how to access that information at your own institution. But because we do have Michigan data and we have national data, I thought it would be helpful to be able to do those comparisons. So if we look at passing college level math in the first year, Michigan does not fare as well as our peers across the country. We, again, 21.9% of our students pass college level math, whereas nationally, it's just over a quarter of students pass college level math. But moving over to college level English, we fare quite a bit better than our colleagues across the country. In Michigan, 43.5% of students pass college level English, and nationally, it's just under 40%. And then in combining the two together, we see that we're slightly below our peers nationally, where we perform slightly worse than our peers do nationally in passing both. Jenny, do you want to talk a little bit about your thoughts about why we see those different numbers in comparison with our peers nationally?
So these, you can see that we're doing better in English. That would be because we had a really successful implementation of the accelerated learning program we were able, with some philanthropic support, to bring in our friends from the Community College of Baltimore County several times, did a number of faculty trainings, and have a lot of colleges that have adopted and fully scaled up ALP. And that really does increase the number of students who are able to pass English quickly. Math, on the other hand, has been slower to take hold in terms of co-requisite work here. Partly it's because we didn't have a generously funded project like we did for English. Partly it's because math is kind of a different animal curricularly, but where you see those bigger numbers nationally, those are also reflecting states that have a mandate to put everybody in co-rec, both English and math. And so we have not put that in place, and so our colleges have been slow to adopt co-rec math. Our peers, states that are ahead of us, are going to be those that have, like Tennessee, more, that have really put some effort into making sure that everybody gets that co-rec option.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, I think those data really show the power of a program like that with ALP and a really widespread implementation of that. So I'm glad that we're doing some more of that work in math right now through my start to finish. Okay, great. Moving on, let's talk about equity gaps. And I am going to launch another poll question. And this poll is slightly different, and I'm hoping that I set this up correctly, but I want to ask, among what groups do you think we have equity gaps? And hopefully you should be able to select all that apply. If you cannot, just select the one where you think we have the biggest equity gaps. Looks like you can maybe select all that apply. we'll give it a couple more minutes for people to look at that. And you can see based on our poll questions, these are the subgroups that VFA disaggregates, and we'll talk a little bit more about those subgroups and why some of them are so important as we continue in the presentation. Oh, great, we have 100% of people on the webinar that have voted. So I'm gonna go ahead and end the polling, and I'm gonna share the results. And I hope you can see the results. And you'll see that about 3 out of 4 of you thought we had gaps in Pell status. Half of people thought we had equity gaps in gender. 92% believe we had equity gaps in race, ethnicity. Just under half in age. 56% of respondents based on full and part-time, and 68% based on college readiness. So why don't we stop sharing those and let's see, let's have a look at some of the data. Oops, sorry. Okay, so first let's look at Pell status. So what we've done here is it's the same data that we showed you before. So we're looking at college level math, college level English, and English and math. But we're showing you the data for all students in the first row, and then we look at students who were awarded Pell and not awarded Pell. You'll notice here, we have gaps, fewer students who were awarded Pell. Well, first of all, I'll back up. About half of our students are awarded Pell. It depends on the institution, but typically between 40 and 50% at most of our institutions are awarded a Pell Grant. And we see that just there's some equity gaps here, but they're probably, as we often say, they're statistically significant, but they're not terribly practically significant. Because, for example, 20% of students who are awarded Pell pass college level English, but only 23% of students who are not awarded Pell pass college level English. So we see gaps there, but we don't see huge gaps there.
And it's interesting too to see that there's a reverse between English and math, where the students who are awarded Pell are slightly more likely to pass college level English than the ones who are not awarded Pell, versus the math, where it's the ones who are not awarded Pell are doing slightly better. That's
odd. Great.
Odd and interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. We've talked about this a lot in our group, and one of the things we think could be happening here with Pell status is some of those students who were not awarded Pell may have financial need. They're just not eligible for the Pell Grant. And so while Pell can be a good proxy for income, it is imperfect because not all students are eligible for the Pell Grant. Of course, we don't have a lot of great ways to measure income at community colleges. This is kind of the best option that we have. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at your Pell data. But let's continue and look at other areas. So next, let's take a look at gender. And we have all students, male and female students, and we also, a student may not have answered the gender question, or the college may not have asked the student the gender question. And so we have some unknown or other. And again, we see some differences in college level math and college level English. But we do see that in college level math, male students do perform better as a cohort than female students, and then the opposite is true in college level English. When we combine both of them together, it's a virtual tie, where we see they're almost exactly the same. But interestingly, among students where we don't have information about their gender, or they've reported something else, those outcomes are significantly lower than what we're seeing for male and female students. Jenny, did you have any other comments about that?
No, that's just an interesting observation based on what, looking at marginalized, potentially marginalized students in a different way.
Yep, I agree. All right, let's continue looking at enrollment status. And this is where you'll notice when we put this presentation together, we've ordered these in such a way where we have where we're seeing larger equity gaps as we continue. So as we look at students whose enrollment status this is in their first term of enrollment, if they were enrolled full-time, which is about half of our students, a little under half of our students were enrolled full-time, and a third of those students passed college level math. And look at that, about almost 60% of those students passed college level English, which is really interesting. That we're seeing a really significant difference here. And then when we look at part-time students, just over 1 in 10 students pass college level math if they enroll part-time in their first term, and just under 1 in 3 students pass college level English if they enroll part-time in their first term. So there is certainly data from a variety of other sources that suggest how important it is that students enroll full-time. And I think that's clearly reflected in the data that we're seeing here. But I also think it's important to think about what else are those part-time students doing, working, caring for family members, being active in the community, that may be impacting their pass rates in college level English and math as well. So again, similar to the Pell status, we're using the enrollment status, full-time and part-time, in some ways as a proxy for some other things that are happening with students as well. Jenny, do you have any other comments about that?
Yeah, I would just want to say that I think that this has implications for how we talk to students and how we approach students. I think that it's easy for us to take a look at the situation of the student who's wanting to enroll part-time and understanding that they may have children or they have other external responsibilities. But what I think it calls on us to realize that if we allow the student to do that, and if we don't take some mitigating steps to make it possible for them to pass those classes early on in their college career, we can see that they're going to do poorly. So we're sitting looking at this data, looking at the students and saying, well, we know you're going to do poorly if you only take 2 classes and neither of them is your developmental math or your co-rec or a co-rec math package with 4 to 6 credits in it, but we're going to let you do that anyway, even though we know that you're not going to do as well. And so I think that's something to think about. Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Or that the student doesn't want to take math early on in their program, or doesn't want to take math as their first class. Mm-hmm. That may be true, but you might think, are we enabling a poorer outcome for that student that we might be able to help prevent?
Great, thank you. We'll continue to look at the disaggregation, and in this case, we're looking at outcomes based on race and ethnicity. You see here again that we have we provided the total number of students in each one of the cohorts. Again, with our base of 38,816 students. And then we've ordered this here by the size of the subgroup. And we see here again that we have significant gaps based on race and ethnicity among our students in most categories, in math and English, and then in math and English together. But particularly, we see that among Black students, among Hispanic students. Interestingly, we see if the race is unknown, or we don't have that information from students, We have slightly better outcomes in math. And then for 2 or more races, non-resident alien, which would typically be non-resident students, and then also American Indian, Alaska Native, and Hawaiian Pacific Islander, we see significant equity gaps as well in there. Particularly pronounced in mathematics, we see equity gaps throughout these subgroups. It is somewhat less pronounced statewide in English, but certainly still equity gaps in English, and then also in English and math as well. And Jenny, do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, I just can't not point out the really sobering data that we're looking at here with our Black students, both in math and in English. And what does that say about our work that is in front of us to help close those equity gaps, and why are those gaps continuing to persist? But those are huge gaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, very significant. I think this is the last subgroup that we're looking at, and we are looking at outcomes by age. This is actually quite unique. It is very difficult to find data disaggregated by age in virtually any other data source. And it also tends to be a disaggregation that we don't pay attention to a whole lot. And I think you can see here where the students who are less than 20 years old, the more kind of traditional age college student, and that would include students who, I'm trying to think if this includes, the main cohort includes students who are dual enrolled. I think the answer is no. So this would simply include the students who are post-high school who are enrolled at one of our community colleges. And in both math and English, their outcomes exceed their peers. And as we start to look at age groups over 20, we see that across the board, outcomes decline significantly. This was really surprising to us when we looked at these data, particularly, like I said, because this isn't widely available typically. But we also know that over time, community colleges have served fewer and fewer adult students. Our enrollment has trended towards students under the age of 20. And so we see a decline in numbers. And then we clearly see a decline in outcomes across the board here as well. Jenny, did you have any comments about these outcomes?
No, I do. I would agree that this is something that we don't typically look at. I think we need to kind of anticipate what might happen as students come back to college based on the recession that we're going to be experiencing. And so I think this age data will come into play there. And it just, we tend to concentrate a lot on those younger students and those students who are right out of high school. But to the extent that, we add up the constituency that is not less than 20 years old, we get half of our students that are faring worse based on their age.
Great. Janice asked a question in the chat about why is the total number of students under 40,000? Because there are far more students enrolled in community college in Michigan. And yeah, Janice, you're correct. There's closer to, depending on the year we're talking about, usually between 150 and 200,000 students enrolled. For these data, we're looking at students who specifically started in the fall of 2017. So they're all the students who just started at our institutions in the fall of 2017. They may have enrolled, they may be enrolling for the first time in a community college, or they may have enrolled in another community college before, but they enrolled it at the institution that reported the data for the first time. in the fall of 2017? Good question. I was wrong. We've got one more. So the last thing that VFA does is look at, disaggregates the data by college readiness. So if the student was completely college ready, if they had developmental needs in one subject, two subjects, or three subjects, the subjects in this case are math, English, and reading. And so their developmental need in one subject could be in any of those subjects. We don't know which one, but we do see here, that once again, if the student is not college ready or not college ready based on the college's current data or current placement practices, that their outcomes are lower than that of their peers. Interestingly enough, with the exception of college level English, if they had a developmental need in one subject, they actually exceeded the average of all students as well. Jenny, did you have any comments about that?
Sure, I'd say that one of the reasons that you see that if they had they do better in English if they had a developmental need in one subject is that it's because it's likely that the need was in math if they only had a need in one subject.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
Chelsea, yes. That means approximately 90% of your students this semester have a 3% chance of passing college level math and English in their first year. That is correct.
Yes. Yeah. So Chelsea asked in the chat that if a student had developmental needs in three subjects, their chances of passing college English and math is 3 out of every 100 students would pass that. Mm-hmm. And if they had developmental needs in three subjects, only 6% would pass a college level math course, but 25% would pass a college level English course. Again, I think that speaks to the implementation of ALP in Michigan. And then also, Jenny, correct me if I'm wrong, but some institutions also focusing on the integration of reading and writing as well.
Yes.
Kathy asked a question if VFA disaggregates college ready based on race ethnicity. And so there are, in some ways, VFA does those kind of intersections of subgroups where they will look at both college readiness and race ethnicity as well, or for example, race ethnicity and age, for example. So I will have to check back with you and find out if they look at race and college readiness, and we can share that information if it's available. But typically you would need to go back to your IR office and they would have the data that they could pretty easily, I won't speak for every IR person, but they could fairly easily get you that data, because I do think it's important as you're unpacking these data to start looking at the combination of some of those subgroups as well. I think that's a really great idea.
Agree.
Okay, so our last poll question is, have we improved? So I'm going to launch that last poll, and instead of just giving you a yes, no, I gave you, we've done this for long enough to know that everybody needs a little bit of wiggle room in the yes. So the responses are yes a lot, yes a little, or no. And we're looking at improvement between 2012 and 2017. So it looks like we have just about everybody has voted. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling. And I'm going to share the results with you. And it looks like about 3 out of 4 people thought we probably improved a little. Few people thought we improved a lot, and a couple people thought we probably didn't improve at all. So I'm going to go ahead, and that ends our poll questions. But I want to look at outcomes between fall of 2012 and fall of 2017. And interestingly, we have improved. So I won't make a judgment on if we think this is improving a little or a lot. But in the percentage of students who pass college level math, we've improved. We've improved a lot among students who pass college level English, from 36% to 43%. And we've improved a little among students who have passed college level English and math. And of course, that really is driving, you know, the English and math combined is very much driven by that math number as well. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about improvement over time. The other thing that I think is really important to look at here, and I don't have to explain this to any of you, but the number of students in the cohort has changed dramatically. We've gone from about 53,000 students that were new to one of our community colleges in the fall of 2012, and that's down to just under 39,000 students in the fall of 2017. You know this because you've seen the enrollment declines at your institution, but I would really encourage you, if you're looking at your data over time, to also look at that data based on, look at the outcomes and your data based on those subgroups as well over time. Because I think you'll see, similarly to what we see across the state, is that the decline in enrollment hasn't been equally distributed across all of those subgroups. We see a significant decline in enrollment in some subgroups over the other. I am particularly thinking of age, where we see, we've seen just a significant decline in the number of adults that we serve in Michigan community colleges. Jenny, any other comments about looking at the outcomes over time?
No, I don't. I think, you know, you can see the impact of our ALP project pretty clearly in those English numbers, which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm. It's great. Okay, so what's next? So we have kind of pulled together, we worked with some IR folks and pulled together some considerations for next steps at your institution. So the first thing we recommend is that you access the data at your college, and I think we have a slide here that provides some information about how to do that, but I would definitely encourage you to talk to your IR office. Much of this data doesn't get shared very widely at community colleges. And so I think it's important for you to identify additional key stakeholders and share your data on your outcomes with those key stakeholders. This can be a great opportunity to do your department meetings, would be a great opportunity to share this data. Remember that we have an editable slide deck that we've posted on our website, and all you really need to do is add some rows for your institution or just change the numbers in the tables that we provided in those slides already. We also have included the poll questions in here because I know most of you are probably still doing these meetings virtually, and we found it helpful for people to do the poll questions. It really helps open up, helps people understand the data a little bit more with those poll questions. Reflecting on your previous intervention and key policy changes, in addition to looking at your data, I think is very helpful, particularly if you're looking at those outcomes over time. Why did those change at your institution, and what interventions can you point to that may have had an impact on those numbers if you're seeing changes over time? And then of course, collectively as your group of stakeholders, identify the key issues or problems and then identify what to focus on. As Jenny has described, there's a lot of really great work happening at Michigan community colleges, so please reach out to one of us or to your peer institutions to learn about strategies that they're using to address some of these issues. I always remember when we've done some of this math work and we're thinking about doing co-requisite in math. One question that always comes up is, well, you know, it seems impossible to make the registration system work in such a way where students could register for the co-req course. And the good news is that most English departments have already figured this out. So we encourage the math department to talk to the English department about that. And then, of course, implementing those practices and policies to address those key issues. You can contact any of us at the MCCA, and we'll be happy to help you out with anything. I wanted to include all of our contact information here because this DevEd, these outcomes are not just a reflection on the math or English department. This is an institution-wide issue. And so it's possible that some of the solutions that you might want to implement would include any of us, for example, maybe a transfer issue or maybe an economic stability issue at your institution in terms of what services you're providing to students. So just keep in mind that this is an issue that the whole institution may want to consider addressing. We've got a few references out there that might be helpful to you as well. And that's all we had for our presentation. I don't see any additional questions. Thank you, Riva, for joining us. And we'll pause now to see if you have any other questions before we end the webinar. Jenny, anything else?
Yeah, while people are thinking or typing their questions, I just want to leave you with the thought, I alluded to this earlier, but I want to kind of say it again, which is that when you look at this data and you identify those gaps, think about what responsibility your institution has in trying to close those gaps, in trying to look at what interventions the college could take, and you know, rather than reeling off the student characteristics that might cause those gaps, rather than, you know, it's very easy to say, well, we see that such and such a group always does more poorly, and you know, we think that that's a result of their socioeconomic circumstances. But now we're looking at, like with the health gaps in COVID-19, where we're saying, well, some of these poor outcomes are due to racism, not, you know, the effects of racism that can be mitigated by the institutional actors perhaps acting differently, rather than the students needing to act differently in every situation. That's how I want to leave you.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Any other final thoughts? Precious and Katie, I'll ask you as well, or anybody else, you can unmute yourself.
I'll just repeat what everybody else has been saying. This is very helpful. It's not something that I've had a lot of instruction or training on, so I've really enjoyed the opportunity to learn along with everybody. And Erica, I appreciate all of your prep.
Great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Erica. This is great.
You're welcome. Well, good. Like I said, slides are on the website. Steal them and edit them as you would like, and let us know if you have any other questions. But with that, we'll let you go, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at 3 o'clock for the first session of the Student Success Summit. So thank you all. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.